Well, we start with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has departed 10 Downing Street after meeting British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. With just one day to go until the U.S. Russia summit on ending the war in Ukraine, its President Volodymyr Zelensky visited London to reportedly shore up European support for efforts to prevent any agreement that would affect the Ukrainian land. According to reports, Zelensky and his allies are keen to avoid any deal between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin that leaves Ukraine more vulnerable to Russian attacks. This comes after Zelensky held virtual talks with European leaders and Trump to reportedly try to set red lines for the talks between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Well, joining us, as always, it's a pleasure to welcome Ross Feingold, a political analyst who's joining us live from Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, thank you for your time. Let's look at this meeting between Zelensky and Keir Starmer, of course significant after that virtual meeting that took place yesterday with European leaders. Do you think this will actually have any influence on the talks between Trump and Putin in Alaska?
It's hard to be optimistic about that if we're looking at it from the perspective of President Zelensky. Trump has set this in motion. He did it, the meeting, he set this meeting with Putin in motion without the input of President Zelensky, without the participation of President Zelensky. And President Zelensky, along with the other European leaders, have been scrambling ever since to have some say, to have some input. And that did culminate in the call with President Trump. But they are not the drivers of the meeting between President Trump and President Putin. The driver of that is obviously President Trump. Look, we all know where this is going, and that's pretty simple. Any ceasefire proposal is going to include that Russia can continue to occupy some of Ukrainian territory. Yeah. And ultimately, Zelensky's going to have to decide whether or not he will accept that. Now, the people who are caught in the middle of that process are the European leaders, because they've been generally, up to now, over the past 3.5 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, the European leaders have been very united in their support for Ukraine. They've provided cash, they've provided weapons, they've committed to continue to provide weapons, more recently by buying them from the United States and giving them to Ukraine. But again, on the assumption that Trump and Putin are going to propose some kind of arrangement for a ceasefire where Ukraine has to accept the reality that Russian military forces are going to occupy part of Ukrainian territory, it's going to be really interesting to see how the European countries react to that.
Yes, absolutely. And Ross, of course, ahead of this meeting, so much on the line potentially. Europe very clear that they don't want Ukraine to be more vulnerable, potentially as well for their own security reasons. But this could be the pinnacle in discussion over a peace deal. How significant is it, do you think, that Donald Trump doesn't necessarily give in to what Vladimir Putin is saying and stands firm with the European allies of Ukraine?
There are a lot of variables there. One variable is there's been past proposals that certain European countries, the European countries with a more formative military capability, like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, might provide, I hesitate to call them peacekeepers, but they would provide an on-the-ground military force on the front line that would act as some kind of tripwire against further Russian military attacks on Ukrainian territory. Again, that's just a variable at the moment. We don't know if the Europeans are willing to do that. Other variables are whether or not Ukraine could join NATO or join the European Union. We know Russia and President Putin is firmly against that. And frankly, President Trump has indicated he doesn't support Ukraine joining NATO and coming under that umbrella of a security guarantee. So again, we're back to a number of variables. we're back to the issue of how unified will the European countries remain if they are presented with a set of parameters that would be a ceasefire, and if those parameters are supported by President Trump, it really will put those European leaders in a very difficult position.
Well, yes, Ross, you will be staying with us because we're going to stay on this topic and another